Hi folks, welcome back. So in this video, I want to continue my Beyond Human in the Loop series, but instead of looking at a paper, I was thinking I'd just do a bit of a side chat and talk a bit about my motivation and why I'm so interested in this topic to start with. So I've been a programmer a long while, and if you look at my blog, I've been talking about automation and programming and how programmers think about their tools and the boundary between what the tools do and what they do. I've been writing and thinking about that topic for a long time. But then automation in general, I got interested in through that thread. And then something happened that poured fuel on the fire. And I swear this will make sense later. That something was aviation crashes. So on YouTube, I got recommended some air crash videos. This was a long time ago. I don't know why, but maybe it was morbid fascination or just the engineering and investigation aspects of it. But I went on this binge watching spree of there's this TV series called Air Crash Investigation or Air Crash Disaster or something like that. Anyway, they have like the entire bunch of seasons, all the episodes on YouTube, and I binge watched all of that. So it turns out that not all, but a big fraction of modern aviation disasters are in one way or another related to problems with automation, autopilot in the cockpit, how maybe autopilot goes wrong, or more often, how pilots incorrectly handle autopilot or are not quite able to deal with flying a plane manually by themselves when autopilot comes off. There were a ton of modern aircraft disasters tied back to automation. And that's kind of what pulled me into this literature that I'm looking at in this Beyond Human in the Loop series. And I'll give you a few examples just to kind of set a more personal stage for why I'm into all this. So one very prominent air crash was Air France 447, which crashed in the Atlantic. And it was a big mystery. It took them more than a year to find the cockpit voice recorder and figure out what happened. And again, the thing that really pulled me into it was a bunch of really beautiful, evocative writing, long form articles by this author called William Languisher, who himself is a pilot, and it shows in his writing. I think he comes from a family of pilots. That makes sense. But he wrote this very long, very detailed article in Vanity Fair about Air France 447. If you go look him up, he's written a bunch of other long form articles about other very prominent air crashes, including the more recent Boeing 737 MAX incidents. But for 447, the main problem with that crash was that there was an instrument failure. Because of the instrument failure, autopilot turned off and handed manual control back to the two pilots in the cockpit. And they could not get enough situational awareness to fly the plane correctly. The instrument that failed was a pitot tube that gave them airspeed reading. So they didn't know what the airspeed was. There were a bunch of other warnings that were going off. It was dark, they were in a storm. So there were a bunch of other very complicating factors. But yeah, if you read the article, the main thing that happened was autopilot came off, gave manual control back to the pilots, and they had a very hard time getting situational awareness. And unfortunately, the plane went into a stall and crashed into the Atlantic. And so you see how in this one incident, all these human factor considerations when it comes to intermingling humans and automation. All these considerations come together in a perfect storm. There's automation complacency because the pilots are so used to flying on autopilot, especially when they're cruising at high altitude. They were just going over the Atlantic. There is skill atrophy in that when they were asked to manually fly the plane, they had a very difficult time. They basically couldn't do it. There is mode confusion because there's all these modes when a plane is flying, even within autopilot. It's not a Boolean. There's different modes of autopilot. There is alarm fatigue because the stall warning was going the whole time, but also because the instrument was faulty. There was a failure with the airspeed readings. There were a bunch of other warnings going off. So there's alarm fatigue. So all these factors got highlighted in this one very unfortunate crash. So that's just one prominent example, but there are a bunch of other airline disasters that have kind of similar themes of human pilots versus automation. The other thing that around the same time really fascinated me was there's this clip on YouTube that has been living rent free in my head for more than a decade. It is a clip of a very experienced American Airlines pilot who's teaching a new crop of pilots at their pilot academy. And this clip is of their class that deals with automation and automation complacency and how to have the right attitude towards autopilot in the cockpit or automation in the cockpit more generally. And maybe I'll put in that clip right here in this video because that is just such a perfect yet succinct treatment of this whole issue.
As we look at this accident history, what we find is that in 68% of these accidents, automation dependency plays a significant part in leading these crews to either a critical flight attitude or the requirement to extract max performance from their planes.
The instructor talks about how automation complacency is becoming a more common factor in accidents, but more importantly, the principle he talks about is choosing the right level of automation for the job.
There's basically 3 levels of automation in our planes. The lowest level of automation, you might call manual, is when you're hand flying the airplane, the throttles and the controls, and by the inputs and cues that you're getting from your instrumentation and your outside visual cues, you are determining the vertical and lateral path of this plane by flying it. The next highest level of automation would be when you have an autopilot engaged and you're using the flight guidance system in your airplane to tell that autopilot what to do with the plane's flight path for short periods of time. You know, like flight level change, vertical speed, altitude hold, heading select, that stuff. And then the highest level of automation is when we have an autopilot engaged and we're using a flight management computer to tell that autopilot what to do with the flight path of this plane for hours and hours. Low, medium, high. Now the question becomes, which is the appropriate level for the task at hand?
He talks about how just always going to the highest level of automation is not always the right answer. In fact, in many situations, the correct thing to do is to drop down a level of automation.
Well, the 2-man crew became task saturated. Well, how did they become task saturated? In the vast majority of the accidents, they became task saturated because they were trying to operate at too high a level of automation and a rapidly changing flight path requirement. Did you hear what I just said? They needed to drop down a level in order to maintain their situational awareness. They had to reduce workload.
And again, this seems very counterintuitive, but I'd encourage you to go back and look at the very first video in the series that talks about the ironies of automation, which is about this very principle, about how automation makes the easy things easier, but the hard things harder. And the reflexive reach to the highest level of automation isn't always the right thing. It's called Children of the Magenta line. And I think it refers to the magenta line on a cockpit display or something. But anyway, so all that is to say, cockpit automation, autopilot, modern aviation, I think it has a ton of lessons for how humans and automation intermingle. And a lot of the literature I'm looking at in this series draws not only from all that, but the broader history of humans in factories or humans in trains, just dealing with machines, not just airplanes. And again, like I said in the very first video in the series, there's so many insights there. There's such a rich literature of how humans deal with all these machines that are automated to lesser or greater degrees that we can really learn from. It's all happening in knowledge work now, but we think that knowledge work is something very different compared to transportation or factories. And it turns out now that it's getting automated, it doesn't look so different than all those older industries. So there's a lot we can learn from this older literature. But anyway, it was my morbid fascination with air crash investigations that sort of kind of pulled me deeper into those. I know that sounds weird, but it is what it is. All right, thanks. Bye.